The flight attendant didn't let an 87-year-old woman into business class. But then they learned who she was. She's a mother, wife, and grandmother. She's 87 years old. The flight attendant stopped her, but it turns out she was on the list. Apparently she could not be denied access to the plane or anything else for that matter. Ms. Wilson had never taken a plane, so when she got out of the airport she was initially confused, so the old woman looked around and decided to follow a group of passengers who were walking around. Were rushing to board the plane. She assumed they knew what to do in a situation like this for a woman who grew up in one of the provincial towns, whose state control at the airport seemed incredible and even a little mythical. The old woman hid the key to the house in her shoe as she always did to make sure she didn't lose it, but she had no idea that the metal detector on the door frame would react. Although Ms. Wilson put on her best clothes for the trip, her appearance causing other passengers to avoid passing her, mistaking her for a beggar or a woman from a low-income family. This is why the woman working at the check-in counter was surprised to see that the old lady had a business class ticket. Meanwhile, Ms. Wilson almost missed her flight because she was following passengers flying across the country. Only with the help of a friendly airport employee did the old woman reach the departure area, where some passengers were waiting to board the plane. The man gave Ms. Wilson an affectionate smile and led her to the gate on her boarding pass, advising her to wait there so she wouldn't get lost at the airport again. All the while the worried old woman with her purse in her hand took a look at her watch and if this was your first time on a plane and asked a young man who had also a business class ticket. "Well, this is the first time that I'm really worried." Mrs. Wilson's voice quivered with excitement. This is when the boarding process begins and the smiling flight attendant politely asks the passenger to enter the boarding bridge connecting the airport to the aircraft. Taking the old woman's boarding pass, the flight attendant escorted Ms. Wilson to her seat. As it turned out, the old woman's seat was next to the smart-looking man, who had a disgruntled expression on his face when he saw Ms. Wilson. Put down her magazine and asked if it was business class. "Why do I have to pay extra to end up sitting next to that old beggar? Mrs. Thompson, please calm down. Mrs. Wilson has the same ticket you can see here on her boarding pass," the flight attendant said. Desperately trying to stay calm, "I don't want to see anything that I get. I should have bought an economy ticket," but the rude man still raised his voice and refused to move his magazine from Mrs. Wilson's seat. All the while, the unfortunate old woman watched with concern as the argument unfolded without saying a word. All other passengers unwittingly sided with some sympathizers with Ms. Wilson while others openly objected to her being in business class. Among those defending the confused woman was the young man she spoke to while waiting to board the plane, unwilling to do the wrongs of the man he decided to defend for her. "Oh, for the love of Mrs. Wilson is much older than you and you behave like a real low-key, keeping her upright while lounging comfortably in your chair." After hearing the man's words, Mr. Thompson was embarrassed and calmed down a bit, but the storm of human outrage in business was unstoppable. Not knowing what to do in this situation and how to regain control, the flight attendant looked at the old woman pleadingly. Ms. Wilson realized that she had unwittingly become the culprit in this scandal. She sighed sadly and said, "Oh, come on, don't argue. I'm going to switch to economy class and it's the end of her life." She bursts into tears saying that and her life seems to have lost all meaning. Indicate. Immediately feeling the searing gaze of several pairs of eyes, Mr. Thompson decided to step back and pull out Ms. Wilson's chair. "Sit down, Mrs. Wilson. This is your reasonable seat and you have paid for it in full." Unable to speak, the old woman carefully sat down, but the woman didn't notice her purse open as she sat. An old photo with curved edges fell off it. Mr. Thompson leaned over and took the photo, noting that it contained a picture of a young boy. "This photo probably means a lot to you," the man asked and showed the photo to his elderly neighbor. Miss Wilson carefully took the picture as if it were the most precious thing in the world, smiled at him and her face lit up. It looked like all her wrinkles had been magically smoothed out. "Yes, he is my son. He is a pilot. He is flying the plane we are flying at the moment," the old woman proudly replied by dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Hearing this poor woman's words, the business class passengers immediately settled into their seats, ready to listen to her story. Dorothy Wilson said she grew up in a poor family with 4 siblings. Her parents Kate and John Wilson ran a small farm that helped them avoid starvation during hard times. Dorothy was the eldest of the children, so all the troubles of raising them fell on her shoulders. Pierre, the youngest of the brothers, is mentally disabled and needs special care and attention. When World War II broke out, Dorothy's father volunteered to join the army where he fought against Japanese troops in the Pacific Islands. Before leaving, John Wilson gave his daughter a golden inheritance from his grandfather. He asks Dorothy to keep the family heirloom safe until she returns. Sadly, John Wilson returned home in a flag-covered coffin, and the Wilson family were devastated by grief over the loss of their breadwinner and head of household. After her father died, Dorothy's mother retired and never met another man to spend her life with. As time went on, Dorothy grew older and it was time for her to think about starting a family of her own, but instead she had to stay with her mother to care for her disabled brother Peter. Kate's other 2 children moved to a big city long ago, leaving their older brother and mother to the mercy of fate. It was not until later that Dorothy Wilson met her true love. She was 28 years old and had given up hope of marriage. Jack is handsome and a shepherd who leads his sheep to find grazing grounds. Their relationship develops so quickly that Dorothy feels like she's in a fairy tale. The couple is planning a wedding, but bad luck has gripped the Wilson family to not allow the poor girl take advantage of your happiness. One evening, Peter, Dorothy's mentally disabled brother, burned down their house. Jack rushes in to try to save him, but unfortunately they both die in the fire. Homeless, Dorothy and her mother are forced to live in an old shack they bought with the money they got from selling lambs. Then, Dorothy found out she was pregnant. Unfortunately at the time, her mother was already showing signs of memory loss, manifested in aggressive behavior. More than once, Kate has attempted to attack her pregnant daughter with a knife, blaming all of her problems on Dorothy. Unhappy, Dorothy gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, but every second she feared her mother would unintentionally injure the baby. Dorothy spent 3 years living in perpetual fear for her child. Celebrated for a short while, Dorothy decides to send boy Kevin to an orphanage. With tears in her eyes, Dorothy sincerely believed that the boy would be better off living in an orphanage than living under the same roof with a grandmother who could harm him. After leaving her son at the orphanage, Dorothy lived with her mother for several years until her death, after which Dorothy returned to the orphanage with the intention of taking her son home, but the woman was informed that Kevin had died. Be adopted. Since then, Dorothy has been trying to find her son for many years but has not been successful until recently. This is thanks to a volunteer organization dedicated to searching for missing relatives, so she bought a business class ticket to get closer. For her son, who is flying the plane at the moment. As it turned out, Ms. Wilson finally got to meet Kevin on his 85th birthday. Now I can die in peace. I don't know if I'll get to heaven, but I'm glad my son Kevin is doing well, the old woman said, sobbing softly. Ms. Wilson's story did not leave any passenger indifferent, some even completely changed their outlook on life. The old woman didn't notice how, after hearing her story, the flight attendant entered the cockpit and said something to the pilot. A few minutes later a message came in from the passenger intercom. It's your captain saying our flight is coming to an end, but our lives don't have to end with this. This life, each of us is full of ups and downs, but there is no reason to believe that some of us are luckier than others. We are all given a chance from birth and our lives depend how we use them without making mistakes. We don't learn the joy of forgiveness. So we shouldn't look for the culprit when no one is there, because we shouldn't blame someone we may not understand. And also I want to tell my mom, who is flying with us today, that I love him so much and that I forgave him a long time ago. She is a good person and she deserves respect. After the pilot's words, the passengers warmly applaud him and are happy to see that everything has ended so well. As the plane landed, Mrs. Wilson hugged her son for the first time in years. Overjoyed, the old woman handed Kevin the blonde loom she had kept all this time, the man carefully hugging the whole family and crying like a baby. To contain your emotions. He waited for this moment all his life.